Hi, David.
Hey, Bob. How's it going?
I can't complain. How are you?
Good. I am well.
Good and well.
Both.
Good. I envy you. I've never been more than one of those at once. So let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available both on streaming video and via audio podcast. And you are David Roberts of Vox, probably known to a lot of people from your time writing at Grist some years ago. You write largely on environmental things. However, today we're going to talk about politics and ideology broadly. And talking about a piece you wrote in Vox that is, I would say, ostensibly about the New York Times op-ed page, joining in that whole discussion, but in a way is more about what modern conservatism is.
Right.
Say?
And the political mainstream's uneasy and confused relationship with it.
Okay. So yeah, because you basically, not to spoil the plot, but you basically say the problem the Times op-ed page faces is you can say you want diverse voices, you can say you want the two tribes to communicate, and we want our liberal readers to understand what's going on and seriously entertain conservative ideas, but you're basically saying there aren't all that many actual ideas in conservatism these days. It's more, tell me if I'm overstating your thesis, but it's more like racism, xenophobia, misogyny, disguised as ideology. Was that going too far?
Well, yeah, I guess I would say that insofar as there was kind of an intellectual side of that tradition that used to be upheld by certain conservative magazines and think tanks and representatives in DC, that side of conservatism has withered, and that what remains is almost completely cultural resentments, white resentment, basically, okay, in a nutshell. And so the whole point was the New York Times has two goals that are incommensurate, right? On the one hand, it wants to uphold certain standards of accuracy and decency. And on the other hand, it wants intellectual diversity and to show its audience, to expose its audience to conservatism and to conservative ideas. But the problem is that the motive force in conservatism these days, the conservatives that matter, the conservative media figures that matter and that most plausibly speak for the base, Trump's base, don't uphold those standards, either of accuracy or decency. So it's kind of an unsolvable problem, and that's why the New York Times keeps ending up with, people like Ross Douthat, which is checks the conservative box but does not check the speaks for anyone or represents anything box.
Yeah, so let's start there actually with the people in the Times op-ed page, the columnists, and your appraisal of them, and then slowly move into the discussion of conservatism more broadly. So Ross Douthat. Let's start with David Brooks. So you write his conservatism of Sam's Club affectation, fiscal conservatism, tepid social liberalism, and genial trolling of center leftists at Davos. Now, does this mean the leftists are at Davos, or he's there, or both? You mean he's done this at Davos?
Oh yes, he's been to Davos. He's sort of like, in a sense, he's to Davos the same thing he is to the New York Times op-ed page, which is sort of their imaginary conservative, sort of their idea, or rather their projection of what they wish a conservative was.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then then there's Bret Stephens and Bari Weiss, who've been much discussed. You say they're a familiar type of glib contrarian. Their opposition to Trump has given them undue credibility among Washington lefties, whom they relentlessly and boringly troll. But whom are they speaking for? And you ask the same question about Brooks. Who does he speak for beyond David Brooks? What has the Never Trump movement amounted to? So you're saying they don't really command many divisions, and the Never Trump conservatives in general.
Yes, that's right. I mean, even I think there was a time when it would be, there's plausible justification for a newspaper to want to represent the Never Trump movement, perhaps alongside Trump representatives. But over time, I think we've seen, and Jonathan Chait had a big long piece on this in New York Times Magazine just a couple of days ago. We've basically seen the Never Trump movement, such as it is, wither. It's nothing now. It's nothing within conservatism. And insofar as there are still conservatives who are Never Trumpers, they are outcasts and relatively lonely. So I'm not even sure I see the justification for representing that movement as such anymore, because it's barely a movement.
Well, I mean, the polls say that, 80% of Republicans support Trump or something?
No, it's like 95. It's exactly as robust as support for George Bush was, or any past Republican president. There's no discernible difference in Republican.
So the difference is the independents. The difference. Something must account for why his approval rating is only 40%, right? There must be some voting.
Right.
Republican presidents.
Right. Right. It's his. I think what you see is just sort of the Republican core being stripped down, so it's only the Republican core left, mm-hmm. right? And I guess on one hand you can see that as good news. It's good news that only those people are falling for this. But on the other hand, it's pretty shocking to me, maybe to you too, how large that core is. Mm-hmm. It's quite a bit bigger, I think, than anyone hoped or thought.
Okay, and then one thing about Bret Stephens is he's an out and out, full-blooded neocon in a way that I'm not sure David Brooks still is. I mean, David Brooks kind of avoids. He doesn't talk that much about foreign policy where it would really show up, but. There is that kind of diversity, right? I mean, he sure. is far and away the purest specimen on the op-ed page, right? Bret Stephens, I mean.
Yeah, purest specimen of neocon. I mean, there is a diversity on the page, and there's even a diversity among conservatives on the page. It's just not represented among that diversity are anyone who speaks in the voice of Trump's actual base. It's like a diverse group of conservative outcasts, basically. It's like conservatives who are wandering the wilderness, have been gathered there.
One thing about what you say about Brooks, he's fiscal conservative, tepid social liberalism. I mean, in a sense, I wonder, has there ever been grassroots support for fiscal conservatism? I mean, there have been Republican elites who said that's what they stand for, and they kind of sold it, and it's like. Their base didn't object, but have there ever been many people who woke up in the morning and thought, we don't get this deficit balance? I mean, and especially now that the deficit gets bigger and bigger and bigger, never seems to really lead to the apocalypse. Wouldn't you like more government things, whether it's infrastructure or Social Security? Sure. I mean, how many people are saying no to that question?
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, the whole Trump phenomenon has sort of put to rest that question, and the answer is no. The answer is no. The number of people in the base who were consistent devotees of conservative philosophy, as we think of it, including fiscal conservatism, was close to zero. And I think that the right way to understand that is when those elites were talking fiscal conservatism, they were talking, we'll take less of your taxes, we'll spend less of your money. I think what a lot of people heard was, we'll take a lot less of your money and we'll give a lot less money to those people. Mm-hmm. So insofar as we're giving stuff to you, right, older white people, that's fine. So there was never any principled opposition to government. It's welfare chauvinism, I think, is the term for it, right? Government benefits for us and not for those other people. In other words, the sort of unifying thread was this sort of tribal this tribalism again, government.
You're saying that's long been the case, that to the extent that there was support. So going back to talking about welfare queens and so on.
Yes. I think that's always been true. And I think that the idea that, like, the Tea Party, for instance, was animated by sort of principled small government philosophy is just silly. As we can see with the deficit question, a really clear case of it. And the deficit question, when they talked about hating deficits, it was just about blocking democratic spending priorities, right? I mean, that's sort of clear to everyone now. And now that they're in office, they don't care about the deficit. So it's the same, I think, for welfare or spending or taxes or any of these sort of supposed principles. It was just about not for them, right? For us, but not for them. It was always tribalism that was the cross-cutting sort of unifying feature, not any kind of economic philosophy, I think. And I think if Trump's victory hasn't convinced people of that, I don't know what could. Like, he didn't even pretend. He didn't, even like Romney, like all the sort of traditional candidates always mouthed those things, sort of ritually mouthed those things. Trump didn't bother. He didn't pretend. He talked openly about increasing Social Security and Medicare for you people, not for other people, right? And they embraced him. He hates free trade. Right. They embraced him. They never liked trade. They liked trade that benefits them and not trade that benefits other people. So he instinctively, I think, saw that it was the tribalism, not the principles, that was animating people. And so he just abandoned the principles and won decisively. So, that settles that to me. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I want to push back a little on the idea that the tribalism is so asymmetrically proportioned that it's more a conservative thing and not at all a liberal thing, or not very much a liberal thing. But let me hold off on that a little. But I mean, why can't you? I mean, so to some extent, first of all, to some extent, you're saying, look, the truth is, it's long been the case that if you are if you let fiscal conservatives onto your op-ed page and they can write all they want, but for a long time they haven't really been representing the base, because the base didn't have some principled opposition to deficit spending. It was always a little more raw than that, right? So this is not that in a certain sense, that part of this is not a problem that emerged first with Trump, right?
Yeah, I think what happened, I mean, to me, what happened with Trump is just that, like, this has been going on, what I would sort of broadly characterize as kind of the intellectual devolution of the U.S. right has been going on for a long time. People have been documenting and writing about it for a long time, starting with Reagan. You can mark it through Gingrich, the theft of the 2000 election. Like, there's plenty of mile markers along the way. I think what Trump did is just destroy any pretense, because, like the people like the New York Times op-ed page clung to the idea that there's this sort of principled republicanism that shares the basic premises and values of American democracy, but just sort of differs on the means, and we're going to have a polite argument about it. They clung to that, and there was a sort of froth of intellectualism over the top of the GOP, especially in D.C. So if you're sort of a sophisticated D.C. resident, you went to the nice schools, you wear suits. There are conservatives in your orbit who also went to nice schools, who also wear suits, who also speak your language and use your concepts, and you can sort of comfort yourself that that's what republicanism is. And I just think that Trump nuked any remaining pretense. So it's been happening for a long time. Now it's just out.
Okay, so two kind of related questions. I mean, first of all, why couldn't you make a comparable critique of liberals? In other words, well, you've got your high-minded economists and social theorists and think tankers who talk about Social Security, but at bottom, it's just a bunch of middle-class people who are greedy. They want more money. They want more Social Security. They could live without it. It's just raw greed. There's no ideas here, right? Why couldn't you? Why is that not? That's the first part. Well, go ahead and respond to the first part. There's a second part.
well, just to back up a little bit, I have made it a point, an obsession even, to criticize the U.S. right and the tribalism on the U.S. right. And I have made a point not to do what you're sort of supposed to do in those critiques, which is add your to be sure paragraph about liberals do this too, and liberals have these problems too, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. I just think at this point, the nature of the right is the overwhelmingly salient factor in U.S. politics, and it's something everybody needs to grapple with and see squarely. And these sort of ritual other side, you know.
Right, but I'm asking.
Caveats. So this is just by way of background. All of which is to say, of course, everyone's tribal. I mean, of course, human beings are tribal by nature. Of course, tribalism is common on the left too. And of course, I'm not trying to say that the U.S. left, all the way down from the top to the base, is composed of sort of scholars of governing philosophy. You know, there's this basic tendency to tribalism in all human beings. I think what we have on the left, insofar as they remain, are some norms that temper those tendencies, right? That suggest deference to expertise, for instance. So if we made up some fantastical plan and the CBO came out and said it's going to raise the debt for $1.2 trillion, we would not simply say, oh, the CBO must be a corrupt part of the deep state. We would feel, in some sense, chastened and at least have to deal with that fact, right? I mean,
okay, but I guess I'm actually don't mean to be getting to the tribalism point yet. The point I'm trying to get to is that there's always been on both sides a disjunction or distinction to be made between the op-edish justification of policy and the driving political forces that give energy to the policies. I mean, politics seems to me, ideologies at some level, any successful ideology is going to have to, in some sense, be an aggregation of self-interested impulses. I mean, you represent people. They say they want things. There are times, like during wars, when you can get them to subordinate their interests to some collective greater good, and maybe you can get them to subordinate their short-term interests to the long-term interests. But by and large, liberal politicians are delivering goods to voters that voters want for themselves.
Sure.
And
no, I get your point.
I mean, now I grant you, to the extent that you're saying that the conservatives are motivated by racism, misogyny, xenophobia, I grant you that's worse than wanting Social Security. But in both cases, and I want to examine that claim that really that is what drives conservatives. But first, I just want to say that to distinguish between the high-minded rationale and the egoistic impulses that the ideology serves, that's not a distinction confined to conservatism, right?
No, here's how I would phrase the difference. And I'm freestyling a little bit, so bear with me. But you know, if you've read Matt Grossman, political scientist Matt Grossman's book, Asymmetric Politics, I forget exactly what it's called. But anyway, he talks about the difference between the two parties historically, and the sort of difference, and this has kind of been exacerbated lately, is that the left tends to be a sort of aggregate of separate interest groups, right? So you got LGBT, and you got unions and professors with these sort of extremely heterogeneous collection of interests and demands, right? And on the right, especially more and more as time has gone on, you get an increasing homogeneity, geographically, racially, ideologically, culturally, incredibly homogenous party. So I just think that on the left, to even have a political party and have a political program already requires, in some sense, some degree of mutual deference to procedurally neutral principles, right? I mean, you have to get that going a little bit on the left just to act as a left, rather than this group of heterogeneous tribes, right? So in a sense, you're already, by building a political program on the left, pluralism is kind of baked in the cake, right? I mean, pluralism and all the things that pluralism entails, i.e. respect for these sort of institutions and rules that govern everyone, some of that is already built in on the left. Whereas as the right, it's become so uniformly older, white, Christian, rural, and suburban people that they don't need any respect for the procedurally neutral kind of institutions or rules that would bind us together. They're all of the same tribe, so they just pursue their tribe's interests. Whereas the left is already a bunch of tribes cooperating.
I'm not sure it's that homogeneous. I mean, first of all, you listed university professors as part of the liberal coalition. I don't think there's a lot of them, relatively speaking. I mean, and on the conservative side, there are comparable numbers of, you could say, elites. I mean, for example, there are small business people who want the favorable tax treatment or whatever. They're part of that coalition. So I'm not sure, but okay. But anyway, there's that. So there you would say that. Pluralism cashes out as what? Tolerance? You're saying that liberals are more tolerant?
Well, I don't like the word tolerance, really, at least in this context, because it's got a bunch of different meanings and it raises all sorts of weird connotations that confuse things, I think. The way I would just put it is to be in a political coalition with a bunch of other tribes that you don't share any obvious immediate interests with requires that insofar as you're going to cooperate, it's going to be cooperation at the level of sort of these procedurally neutral rules that will benefit everyone or under which everyone can cooperate and benefit, right? And so it's less tolerance than just kind of structural, I'd put it this way, structural tolerance, as opposed to the kind of tolerance people think of when they hear tolerance, which is just sort of soft-hearted individuals. I just mean rules built in such a way that everyone can abide by them and live together under them. Okay.
So anyway, back to this idea that liberal domestic policies. I was suggesting that liberal domestic policies, however high-minded the justification, always, in some sense, are serving egoistic impulses at the grassroots level, or often.
But I don't know about that. I would actually question that. Maybe not. Maybe the sort of altruistic policy doesn't dominate on the liberal side, but certainly more on the liberal side than on the conservative side. People are willing to raise taxes on themselves and have that money spent on poor people, or on foreign aid, or on healthcare, which is going to go to other people. You know what I mean? There seems that I don't know that the level of correlation with self-interest is the same. It seems like there's more altruism baked in the cake on the left side.
It could be. I won't. But what I was getting to was, in any event, if like defending liberal policies, economic policies, is the kind of thing that that could be done on the New York Times op-ed page, because it doesn't boil down to whatever raw impulses you see on the right. And Trump actually did represent those things in the campaign, and he hasn't actually disavowed them yet. Paul Ryan didn't get his way, right? They did the tax cut, but as of now, a tolerance for Social Security and so on, and at least nominally, Trump says that he wants better health care. He does, he wants something better than Obamacare. Now, I grant you that that's not, that there are people in his party who want to use his opposition to Obamacare to deliver something other than something better than Obamacare. They just want to kill it. But I guess what I'm getting at is, like, when you were talking about what Trump said kind of during the campaign and so on, why is that not a coherent ideology? It's like, okay, immigration restrictionist, skeptical supposedly of foreign military entanglements, although tough in the war on terror, but open to government spending on infrastructure for Social Security and so on. I mean, that qualifies as an ideology that you could speak about in high-minded terms, right?
Well, let's make a distinction. I think there is an ideology floating out there, available,
Right.
Right? And this is what Bannon was groping towards. But even on that, I have questions, because ultimately, Bannon's whole shtick is our country is a sort of white Christian patriarchal culture. We came here and built this great thing, right? And we have proven ourselves smarter and more clever and better than the world's other peoples. And now basically they're coming in, liberals from the inside and immigrants from other countries on the outside are coming in to dilute that culture. And it is a perfectly valid thing for members of that culture to want to hang on to it, right? So in a sense, it's like, this is our country and our tribe dominates it, and we're going to retain our tribe's dominance. I guess you could call that an ideology.
Well, I mean, he wouldn't put it exactly. I don't think he puts it that way. I mean, that
well, what else could nationalism mean? It's particularist, right? I mean, it's by nature.
Well, right. Well, we can always cynically assess. And look, I'm happy to be cynical about Bannonism. I'm certainly opposed to it, but it seems to me that the point of your piece is like, I mean, the right is equally cynical about what they call identity politics, right? I mean, I assume you have like a high-minded justification of what they call identity politics, right? And you have a reason that it's not tribalism, right? But they call it tribalism, and so on. I mean, what is your ideological? What do you reply when they say what they say about identity politics? It's just first of all, it's just interest group politics. We give this to the Latinos, we give this to the blacks, and so on. That's what they say. I assume you think it's more than that, but in any event, they don't characterize it the way you do, right?
Yeah, I think if you had to summarize what's happening on the right in the last decade, is sort of through economic and demographic changes, it is the tribe of rural and suburban white people coming to consciousness of themselves as a tribe.
Yeah, it's,
right?
it's identity politics.
Exactly. It's white identity politics, which is something you don't need if your dominance is so thorough as to be invisible, right? Yeah, it's only when it's challenged that you become aware of it. So now, yes, that's right. On liberal politics is on the ground level, as a matter of a sort of fact, it is a bunch of jostling of a bunch of separate interest groups negotiating for their own interests, right? And now the enduring horror to white people is that white people are now another group among those groups jostling for their interests too, and that is. So
why are they less any right than the other people?
Well, they're not. It's just that the other people are not saying us getting what we want requires suppressing you and denying you your rights and blocking you out of the country and treating you and having law enforcement treat your people worse, right? They just want a fair place at the table. Now look, if you took Hispanics, just to pick one out of a drawer, took Hispanics, and eventually they were so dominant in the U.S. that they came to be the dominant group, and they eventually took over, and eventually their dominance would come to seem natural to them too. It's not, I don't know that there's nothing sort of intrinsic in whiteness about this. Right. It's intrinsic in humans and power, but it's just that this particular tribe had power for so long, and now as it is challenged for power, becomes a tribe among others, and has to, and so you see stuff like, I mean, to me, the most crystalline example is the war on Christmas, right? Because the objection was not I was insulted because someone used someone else's cultural greeting for me, right? Like I'm a Christian and someone used a Jewish greeting for me. It's I'm a Christian and someone used a generic holiday greeting for me, right? We went from my culture being the default.
Yeah, well, I think in that case,
generic. That's the objection.
I think in that case, it's also the sense that if they say Merry Christmas, they're doing something controversial. I think that's part of their concern is that.
But who is? But it's one of those. It's made up. Who's being persecuted for saying Merry Christmas? No one. Like there's no. That's not happening. Like I'm sure they probably.
I'm not defending them. I'm trying to. And in general, let me just say, I hope it's clear that I'm not a Trump supporter.
No. I know you're just being a devil's advocate here.
Completely horrifying at almost every level, but I think this is a good chance to plug the Mindful Resistance newsletter and my Mindful Resistance project, because if you go to mindfulresistance.net, you'll see I think it is essential to understand what led people to vote for Trump. It's essential. I think in general in life, it's essential to try to put yourself in the position of whoever you disagree with or whoever you're fighting with, not for purposes of feeling their pain or even caring about them necessarily, but for purposes of understanding how they're processing information. I think it's critical in the case of Trump, if we're going to win the next election, to understand why they voted. So whenever I try to put forth their position, I don't mean to be defending it, but I just want to be clear. It isn't just with the Merry Christmas thing that when you say happy holidays to them, they are offended. I think it is more that they feel that they're not supposed to say Merry Christmas.
Well, I think I think that the way to capture that is the shift from Merry Christmas being the default to Merry Christmas being an option, one of many, feels like persecution. When you're used to being in charge, when you're used to being at the center, being one group among many feels like persecution. This is like a notorious, I don't know if there's a word for it in psychology, but it pops up again and again across history. When you're used to sort of being the default, when you're not the default anymore, it feels like you're being picked on, right?
I think there's no doubt.
This is
no doubt that a part of this is that things have changed. It's like I used to not have to click I want English at the bank, right? I mean, no, this is the way, this is a dynamic, and people just, and maybe older people more and so on, but I totally grant you that it matters who has been in power and who is in power now. At the same time, or who seems to be coming to power from the point of view of the powerful. At the same time, I do want to emphasize two things. One, you said, well, we on the left, we don't ask that what we want for our people come at the expense of anyone. Well, first of all, I mean, that's just objectively not exactly true. Admissions to college is a zero-sum game. If there's a slot, this is, first of all, what they would say about affirmative action. And in this case, in a technical sense, they'd be right. I'm not against affirmative action, but I'm pointing out that it's not a non-zero-sum game. There's a finite number. There are justifications for wanting the zero-sum game to come out one way or the other. But when you say we're not asking for anything at their expense, A, it's their perception that you are, and B, in at least some cases, they're right.
Yeah, I think those are the, pardon me.
Okay.
I'm on the wrong tube. I think those are the exception.
I hope it wasn't something I said.
Those are the exception rather than the rule. And, but yes. Two things. One is if you're in the middle and in charge and you're asked to be one of many, that feels like persecution. That's one level of angst. There's another level of angst, which is you've been in charge and you've been treating other people badly or treating other groups badly, and other groups now want recompense for past bad treatment, which you just culturally and psychologically do not see as treating badly. You just see as the way things are, right? So all of a sudden the way things are, A, is changing super fast, such that you're where previously you were just normal, you were just a person. Now you're a white person, a very specific person having to defend being that kind of person. So that's a change that's freaks you out. And then all of a sudden, hey, it turns out just by being part of this group, you're complicit in all these crimes and owe other people recompense is doubly horrifying. And I think you're getting at this. With the war on Christmas, if it was just a matter of people saying happy holidays, right? That's just procedural neutrality, right? But I think they see every step toward procedural neutrality as a slippery slope toward ultimately them being persecuted and being forced to repay, right? Being forced to give up stuff to other groups in repayment for the alleged previous sins. Like I think they see all that as a slippery slope.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I'd say about this broadly, and first of all, I think my own view is that if you look at people who vote for Trump and care about, say, an issue like affirmative action, the actual nature of these people ranges all the way from actually racist to not obviously explicitly racist, but maybe kind of racist to roughly as racist as everyone, like in subtle ways, bigotry infiltrates their mind. But I personally think there's just a huge diversity. But I want to say one thing about the privilege is that, they don't accept your premise. You may want to argue with them, but a lot of these people don't accept your premise that they are privileged. And and one reason is that they might cite is if you look at their economic circumstances, they're not doing that great. And they've got like a kid who's addicted to Vicodin, and things are not going that great. And so when you say, you understand that, you're a beneficiary of white privilege, they're like, are you on drugs? I mean, and I just have to say, I mean, that shouldn't surprise you. This is the way.
No, I totally get that. No one, I mean, never mind the poor person with the opiate addicted kid. No one wants to hear that they're privileged, right? I mean, look at extremely rich people now who are among the groups in our society the most violently resistant to the notion that they're privileged. And if there's anybody where the case is sort of clear, right? So it's not a political strategy. It's not like a political message that you want to go out and lead with. And I totally get why, given the many inclement circumstances that people in rural, white, small towns and suburbs are facing, that they would absolutely bridle at that and hate that. I've had this exchange personally many times. I've talked to a Southern good friend, lifelong friend of mine who started his own company and is now pretty successful. And we were talking about white privilege. And he said, nobody's ever done anything for me, right? I worked for everything I got. Show me the favor I got. Show me when anybody gave me anything. And so you try to explain to someone like that the presence of an absence, right? The absence of police hassling him, right? The absence of people ignoring his calls because his name on call waiting sounds black,
is
right?
Tyrone or something,
right? I mean, all this stuff.
That's the name they used in the actual studies where they send the resumes out, and if your name is Tyrone, you get 50% as many replies or something as if your name is, Bob.
Right. Or all the many times he interacted with law enforcement and escaped with warnings or scoldings or small tickets, just all those things. It's an absence that it is very difficult to notice. You have to train yourself to notice it. And of course, like during these times we're living through, there's all these people roughly in my and your situation, i.e. white people, sort of white men raised in a certain circumstances and now being sort of going through this whatever journey of wokeness or whatever you call it, trying to sort of wake up and find a reasonable perspective on these privileges. And it's one of those things where it's just like, it's like with the same friend, actually, I was talking about Me Too. And he said, And he said, it's just hysteria about nothing, just little, anytime anybody winks or says anything, no, it's a big deal. And it's one of those things where you just don't notice, but once you start noticing the sort of day-to-day microaggressions that women face in every circumstances, it becomes ubiquitous. So it's almost like it's almost less like persuading someone of something than shifting their perceptions. And I don't really know how to do that.
No, I think you're exactly right. And I mean, I should emphasize, I would like to have the conversation I'm having with you with them, so to speak. And I actually have several Trump voters in my immediate family. None are my offspring, I'm happy to say. It's not like parental malpractice. It's like you can't choose your siblings, No, I love them all. But but I will not be talking politics with them for the next decade. So I really, and actually that's a whole weird thing where I get so agitated about this that I can't have the conversation with them. And so that's my problem. But anyway, I would like to have this conversation with them. And just as I'm saying to you, try to put yourself in their shoes. Try to put yourself in the shoes of a black person or a woman in the workplace or anything else. But I think you're absolutely right that it's not just a matter of logical persuasion. I mean, I think the key variable in terms of people's ability to put themselves in the shoes of other people, not all that empathetically, just sympathetically enough to understand like what it's like to be them. Mm-hmm. I think it very much has to do, I mean, it's kind of a vicious circle in a sense, because it has to do with whether you're viewing your relationship to them as zero-sum or non-zero-sum. If you start off thinking of them as a threat, then the mental equipment is just going to shut down. I mean, I think we're designed that way. If you view them as a rival or as an enemy, you're not going to want to really get it. Whereas if, get what's going on in their head. Whereas if you view the relationship as non-zero-sum, there's a sense of, hey, we can do business, or we have a common purpose, But see, that's what this gets back to why. And you actually use the terms, I think, racist and misogynist and so on. I'm very leery of using those terms to describe them because, in part, that kind of makes you seem threatening to them, right?
Yes, I mean, this is the unsolvable problem, right? With it not being about persuasion, it being about perception. To change, I mean, you just got done writing a book on Buddhism, this, to change the way you see the world and filter the world is not a matter of learning facts, right? It's a matter, there's something else that goes on, and it's an experiential thing. And so however it is that people go through that experience where they're able to shift their perceptions in those ways, the least propitious circumstance in which to attempt that is when you're under attack by a political rival, right? I mean, that's when you're least likely to do those things. Like for me, it was just, I'm on, I have a lot of good female friends, and I'm on a lot of sort of email mailing lists with women. And it wasn't so much them saying, this is what we go through, as on a day-to-day basis. Look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. And no one of those is big, you know what I mean? But just over time, you're like, holy shit. Like, you start to see it everywhere. And it takes pardon the term, a safe space for you to be able to make that transition. And this, insofar as I have some sympathy for, I think, Trump voters and for these culture is absolutely got to be bewildering to them. The speed at which things are changing, the speed at which things that seem obvious and time-tested and unquestioned, that you would never question, are all of a sudden up for question. And there's no safe space to make that transition in the way they say. There's almost no one sympathetic attempting to walk them through it. Everyone they encounter with that message hates them and is attacking them with it. So there's the chances of them being able to, any one individual of them, much less sort of en masse, being able to kind of open themselves up to some of this stuff just seems slim to me. What would be the mechanism or the
Right.
context.
I mean, there's two problems I kind of have with what I would call essentialism, like viewing all Trump voters as racist or misogynist or xenophobia. I mean, one is it discourages you from doing the exploration of what the dynamics are. And even a racist, I want to know why they're racist. Even a Nazi,
Sure.
I want to know why they're Nazi. I mean, I want to understand what forces led to this. So, but I think in general, when you start putting people in these categories, it discourages you from figuring out what exactly the problem is. To what extent are there economic forces, which, as we've already suggested, they might share an interest with liberals in addressing, right? There is that kind of common ground, and I think if terms like racist, whatever, they discourage you from looking at economic. They don't necessarily logically preclude that, but I think they discourage that. So that's one thing I don't like about that. The other thing is just that it's not a way to get them to warm up to us.
No, I hate the word racist because it's a thing that you are or are not, and no one. I mean, they're only the most extreme sort of far end of the racist spectrum would self-identify as racist, right? I mean, no one. Very few of the sort of workaday racists in this country would self-identify as racist. Obviously, they're not proud of or explicit. So obviously, for almost everyone, it's not that they're an ist. It's not that they're a particular thing. It's just that they've accepted certain cultural categories and narratives and certain ways of seeing things, and they've inherited those things, and those things are shot through with racial a bias. So whether an individual is racist or not is just, to me, almost a complete distraction. We have structural racism that produces structurally racist outcomes, and we have, but also this gets back to something you said earlier. There's been this weird, on the one hand, where people like me are constantly told, you need to understand the Trump voters. You need to understand the base, listen to them, go talk to them, blah, 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 blah. And then when I go out and I look at interviews and surveys, and I listen to what they say on those surveys, and I listen to what they say in interviews, and I look at the research that does polling and survey research, and what emerges from that is that those people are primarily driven by hostility toward women and other races. Then I come back and I'm told again, that's not an acceptable answer. Go understand them harder. But what if understanding them leads to a negative view of them? This is something that we seem to logically precluded as a result. But I feel like I do understand them. I think it's pretty unpleasant set of forces and instincts driving them.
Yeah. And I will say that I think in your piece, the time you use racism and misogyny is in that context. You cite a bunch of studies, which I haven't looked at, so I can't opine, but you say, according to the studies, what distinguished Trump supporters most of all, more than income or education, was racism and misogyny, i.e. feelings of hostility toward minorities and women. I'd want to take a good look at those studies, but even if I came to agree with the language, I'd still want to know, how did they get that way? I mean, it hasn't been passed down through their family for generations. And
don't you think so? I mean, I think it got that way from the beginning, from the Civil War.
Well, then why has it not been manifest in previous elections?
Well, I think it has. I mean, there has not been, of the two major political parties, neither has taken it upon itself to explicitly sort of represent these people for various reasons, various restraints. But there's that's always been an undercurrent in the Republican Party going all the way back.
But you would presumably, so you don't think so basically you just see this as an eternal feature of American life that finally a politician figured out how to exploit successfully?
I not eternal. I think the process by which we're transforming from a white Christian patriarchal culture that claims universalism and pluralism to an actually pluralistic culture that is composed of multiple demographics, none of which have dominance, is a long process and a painful process, and we're just at this stage in that process where I think that the pressure has become great enough, and the sort of tribe that feels itself under attack has become sort of unified and homogenous enough that you get this open backlash. Now, what's the next phase of that process? I wish I had any idea. I don't know that anybody knows, but you know, it's depressing. But on the other hand, it's kind of exciting because it's not clear that the world has ever had a genuinely multicultural, peaceful democracy, right? It's always, even in the fabled Scandinavian countries, it's mostly sort of racial homogeny that does a lot of the work of
I would have said 20 years ago, we were the closest the world's ever come. Maybe, I mean, I wasn't around in the Roman Empire, but you know, there aren't that many examples.
Right. And we're seeing that it turns out to be really fucking hard. And it turns out we weren't nearly as close as we thought. Like, a lot of the sort of surface peace had to do with structural injustice, right? With one group being on top. And so what does it mean to have genuine justice? What does it mean to have multiple tribes supporting an entity that they are explicitly only one member of? You know, we just don't know what that looks like. We don't know if it's possible, I think, to go through this period of backlash and emerge from it healthy, or if things just fall apart when no one group is dominant. This is sort of haunting my boss Ezra too. He's been talking about it in podcasts lately, but you know, we sort of like to think of human nature, especially us liberals, as kind of perfectible and heading towards greater union, but maybe genuine pluralistic democracy is just contrary to human nature and impossible. I would never even admit that possibility 2 years ago, but I've opened myself to a lot of new possibilities.
And I don't think it's like racism is in the genes or anything, but I think people are all coming to acknowledge that tribalism is to some extent deeply built into human nature, and it can assume many forms. It can be your religion that's the tribe. Sure. It can be your athletic team. That's the better case scenario. It can be your race, but it's something I think we have to cope with, and it's one reason I just think we have to talk about these issues kind of carefully and with an earnest attempt to understand. But because basically everywhere you look, it's human beings who their environment converted human nature into what they are, right? I mean, it's like, and I mean, to get back to that, let's take a case like immigration. Now, this is something that kind of has changed in terms of the number of, over the last, 30, 40 years, number of people from Latin American countries who could come in and work, willing to work at lower wages. If you're, in the Midwest, your son doesn't have a job, you look at the meatpacking plant, and maybe it used to be unionized or something, and now it's all people from Guatemala who are getting, $6.50 an hour, whatever they pay. It's not shocking that A, you start to see immigration as a problem, and B, human nature being what it is. I mean, as I said, once you start seeing these people in zero-sum terms as competitors, and it could well be that 10 years ago, there were a couple of Latinos in town, and hey, no problem, and suddenly, I mean, I think this is a case where a view can actually change in response to circumstances, right? And it's not a fact about human nature that I'd celebrate that people in situations like that may start veering towards xenophobia or racism. But I guess you'd acknowledge that's a case where you can point to recent circumstances, right?
Oh, no. I mean, just to say again, I totally understand I totally understand why these economic changes and why these demographic changes are sparking resistance. It's no mystery, and I 100% am willing to say that if I were born into those circumstances and had grown up in that culture and was seeing the same thing, I would probably react the same way. Like, again, I'm not trying to say that this certain group of people are sort of dumb or malfunctioning or intrinsically sort of bad. It's just human beings don't like change, especially when it displaces the things that have brought them comfort and meaning. And I think, we have to, the only way it works, so you see this, you see the dynamic in, say, immigrants coming in, taking low wage, or coming in and taking manufacturing jobs. But you see a similar dynamic all over the place in that big changes that are in aggregate good for the public generally are going to be bad for some people. So the case I'm obsessed with now is West Coast housing, right? All these NIMBYs in these single family neighborhoods that now need to be made more dense. Making them more dense would be better for the globe, for the city, for most people, but it would legitimately be bad for those people who are in those houses now. So how do you make those transitions? The only way I feel like you can do it without violence is if the tribe coming in and the tribe that's already there somehow feel an allegiance to a larger overarching tribe, right? I mean, that's how it works. Is we're all like, even though we're displacing you here, we're all part of this bigger thing. We're all going to take care of each other. You'll be taken care of. And that seems to me what has been, we thought that larger thing, America, was a sort of beautiful abstraction about ideas, but it turns out that it really rested a lot on the sort of racial hegemony of whites. And so what replaces it?
Well, but
right
I think
now it looks like nothing, right? That's why every conflict seems zero-sum and seems apocalyptic, because we don't seem to have any allegiance to any broader thing.
Right.
It's
yeah, but I think there's another complication there, which is that, and I should say, in defense of those Trump voters, which isn't all of them, who are antagonistic toward black people or Latinos or whatever, they're also antagonistic toward a certain category of white people, including you and me. And what's interesting is what I think a big part of the grievance is. They don't believe that our fundamental allegiance is to America. We are cosmopolitan, coastal elites who are at home talking to somebody in Germany who also went to a good university, as we are, and they think that we don't care about them as being any more part of our tribe, and maybe less a part of our tribe. And there's some truth to this.
That's not totally wrong either. Right.
So it's not just, they're not the only ones who are failing to buy into a larger American project that encompasses us all. And
right.
I don't even want to act like I think that's the ideal. I personally think every human in the world is equally important as the next. Someday I hope that nationalism as a force will be diluted. So I'm not necessarily chastising us, but I am saying that, first of all, it's not just, there's the tribalism, in a sense, it's equal opportunity antagonism. It's like there's a lot of white people they're not happy about. And the issue is that one of the issues is not the only issue. I mean, there's issues like Merry Christmas, there's issues this and that, but one of them is our allegiance really to America? They don't think of us as patriotic.
Right, but they have this conception of America, right? Like our conception is too cosmopolitan for them, and theirs is too sort of ethno-nationalist for us, right? And the question is whether there is anything, even conceptually, that could still unite those two perspectives into a country, right? And it's not clear that there is. I mean, I'm with you. Like, I mean, if you ask me in my heart of hearts, I am cosmopolitan to the point that would I feel like horrify most actual human beings. Like I think, I'm ultimately for open borders and all that stuff too. Ultimately, I think all human beings are worth the same thing. But it's become very clear.
Not to mention dogs such as the one that just made an appearance here. Would you like to?
Oh, hi, Forrest. That's my dog,
Okay.
Forrest. He's and yeah, animals. Eventually, all of life. I mean, I'm for being for life and against death. but
I join you. I join you in your anti-death crusade. I feel, if anything, I'm closer to it than you are. I think in my heart. But
people need, like, what we've seen is people need those. People need something beneath humanity, capital H, that's not sustaining to them, right? They need something beneath that, and so, or at the very least, if you want to get there eventually, you have to walk people up through bigger and bigger us's, right? So you have to at least get to country. And instead, we seem to be going the other direction, where our sort of us's are getting smaller and smaller, and the lines are getting brighter and brighter.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, in a sense, the tribes are going global. They have their version of globalism. And this isn't true of all Trump supporters, but Marine Le Pen. I mean, ethno-nationalist. Steve Bannon does the ethno-nationalist global circuit, right? And so in that sense, they're getting narrower, but they're not getting smaller, right? Oh, and you have a cat too.
Two of them. It's a menagerie up here.
Yeah.
That's Anakin and Obi-Wan. That's Anakin there.
Yeah. It looks like a great place to live. So anyway, there's all that. I mean, the other thing I'd say quickly is when you say, the trouble with their ethno-nationalism is it's not big enough. It doesn't encompass all. I mean, they make the same thing. They say the same thing about identity politics. They say, look, if in your America, a black person sees himself as fundamentally black, a Latino is fundamentally Latino, a woman is fundamentally a woman. In other words, if that identity trumps all other identities, now it isn't very often put this way at the average, household of Trump voters, but I mean, this is a critique you hear, then that is also not a kind of a transcendent allegiance to America.
Sure. I mean, America is highly contested, right? So the black people would say it was never a universal conception of America. It was a white America. Of course, I don't feel allegiance to that. Of course, we need a new version of America that distinct tribes can all sign on to. And I think the culture that sort of owned the concept prior both doesn't want that and probably has trouble envisioning what that looks like, or how it would be meaty enough to be satisfying. You know what I mean? You get to a certain level of abstraction where it doesn't carry any meat. It doesn't carry any connotations. It doesn't carry any sort of suggestions or symbolism. So, so both sides are wrestling with the problem of how to find a larger unity in heterogeneity, right? And so one side solution is to reject the heterogeneity. The other side solution is what exactly? If I felt like I could turn around and start writing articles about liberals tomorrow and their problems and difficulties, and there are many, and I think I think to describe it most broadly, this sort of idea that history's over and we're just fiddling technocratically to perfect things clearly is not working anymore. Clearly, tax credits and micro programs, midnight basketball, whatever, feels ridiculous and inadequate to everyone now. Clearly, we need something bigger and broader and better. But what is that? What is the next liberalism? I mean, is it Bernie or is it something else like that? But clearly, we need something that unifies us all. That is less wan and tasteless than Bill Clinton's famous "work hard and play by the rules." Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that was the sort of dim message. This is what unites us. We all work hard and play by the rules. I was like, I guess that's.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, the challenge is in a way even stiffer than this, because ultimately, well, I won't go there, but I mean, there has to be a kind of a global tolerance. I mean, there, of the globe's tribes, but also active cooperation with them. And I'm not just talking about climate change, which I know is a big thing for you. That's one thing, but there's a lot of other things. There's a lot of controlling biological weapons and doing this and that, and that's the scary thing. It isn't just about bringing America together. It's about bringing the world together. So but on your thing about you were steering toward. Did you actually just mention Bernie? You did, right?
I'm afraid I did.
Okay, so just quickly back to the New York Times op-ed page. What you say is there's no voice of Bernie there. And first of all, Bernie's an interesting figure because your instinct is to say, well, look, if there's one thing that isn't going to bring America together, it's the far left. And yet, Bernie was viewed more favorably, I think, by a number of Trump voters than Hillary was, precisely because he is speaking in a serious way to some of the economic issues that I'm saying may motivate some of what.
No, I mean it is a core pretension of the, or not pretension. That has a negative connotation, but it's one of the sort of core premises that they are attempting to unite, right? Where mainstream liberalism is just fussing around with this interest group and that interest group. It's one of their main sort of premises of Bernie that the relevant unity is class-based, right? Which is much sort of broader than any of the sort of kind of group divisions that liberals mess with in social policy. I think, and I go back and forth on that. On the one hand, I like the instinct, right? I like the idea of of speaking for the common interests of the 99% or even the 90%. And they do obviously have common interests. But then again, I come back to, I go and read my Jamel Bowie, or I go read, what's his name in the New Yorker, and they just keep warning people like me again and again. People have been trying to unite based on class for centuries now, and race keeps thwarting it. And if race is this weird false consciousness sort of epiphenomenal kind of peripheral phenomenon that's just kind of distracting people from their much more obvious common interests, it sure does have a peculiar staying power. It sure does have a peculiar power to destroy all those attempts. So this is why I think this is why I think I like the instinct towards universalism and towards a broader conception of our common interests. But I don't want to go back to a kind of white naivete about the power of that and the broad appeal of that, or the ability of that to sort of, it just as often masks differential racial preferences and policies as it does get rid of them. You know what I mean? It makes things look equal and meritocratic, even as it produces racist outcomes. So I don't know what the right balance of those two instincts is. And I'm not sure anybody on the left does, which is why the left is so incoherent right now.
Okay. So, and on along the kind of New York Times op-ed page to mention, I'm curious, Michelle Goldberg, who's a new acquisition there, is she not, I don't know where she is exactly on domestic policy. I would think she's closer to the Bernie side of Hillary, I would think, but I don't really know. Does she not represent that?
No. She's, I think she's very strong. She's very angry and outspoken, but I think in policy terms, I think she's pretty, center left, kind of Hillary establishment, whatever. Just like everybody else, she's certainly angry about the depredations of Trumpism, but I don't think philosophically or ideologically she sees herself as speaking.
So who would you like to see? Who would be a good hire for the Times from the?
Oh, my God. I cannot imagine a question more designed to get me
in trouble.
In trouble. I don't know.
My goal.
Kevin Drum did a poll a poll on his
did he?
blog, and who was it that won? I think it was Matt Brunig or I don't remember who won. I'd have to go look at it now.
It was for the New York Times. That was the poll.
Yeah, that was the whole pretense. Like, the New York Times needs a far lefty. Who should they hire? And there were 3 or 4 names. I don't want to get involved in picking between them. But there are, like, that to me is maybe unique among sort of political factions in the U.S. today. There really is a purely kind of policy-based ideological perspective to articulate, right? They have a policy program, they have specific policy preferences, and so that's just the kind of thing you'd like to see in the New York Times op-ed page, right? Is sort of educated, empirically informed arguments about the best way to construct policies for our sort of shared goals. That's, I just don't know what that would look like coming from a Trump supporter. And maybe if you disagree, you can tell me, but would it be like a Bannon-style nationalism? Because even that no longer fits what they're doing.
Here's what I'd say on that. Is you said, look, if the Times wants to hear from the Trump side, here's the line. If the Times wants to find authentic expressions of the sentiments animating Trump supporters, it will have to look beyond the confines of the elite establishment to Breitbart, Town Hall, and InfoWars. Well, of course, 2 of those. I haven't looked at Town Hall lately. Maybe it's now as bad as Breitbart and InfoWars.
It's pretty bad.
Pretty bad. Okay, but I was surprised you didn't mention the American conservative. And I was surprised you didn't mention Pat Buchanan. I mean, ideologically, if you look at the Trump of the political campaign, he represents something intellectually that has had reasonably smart people who defended it in intellectual terms, and it's Buchananite conservatism. And there is an outlet like that right now. It's called the American Conservative. And they write stuff, right?
Yeah.
So why didn't you?
That's fair, but you know, one of the women who writes for Vox, Jane Coaston, is great on this, and she's, you know, the point she makes is she follows the right very closely, and she's like, there's roughly 2 groups. There's kind of the Trumpism, the people who thought there was such a thing as Trumpism, right, with some coherent program involved or some coherent perspective, and the people who were just Trumpists, who just were basically followers of a strong man. And she sort of chronicled the disaffection of the former group over time. So almost no matter what coherent ideology you choose to pick, Trump has crapped on it at some point or another.
Well, I think it's true that
appears erratically all over the place. So there's no. So even like a Pat Buchanan, I'm sure at this, like you saw Ann Coulter is off the bus. I'm sure Pat Buchanan got off the bus a while back because there's no coherent program is served by what's going on now, right?
Well, right, but then that's partly because Trump isn't a Trumpist in the ideological sense. I mean,
exactly.
I mean, what they don't like, and I know people at the American Conservative who vote. I know at least one person who voted for him and is extremely unhappy with him. In that case, it's because foreign policy-wise, he's not doing what he said about the perils of military intervention. Other people, you know, Ann Coulter is unhappy because he's not building the wall, although God knows he hasn't been a liberal on immigration. I mean, he's trying to terrify every brown-skinned person in the country. That's not enough for her, apparently. She wants the actual physical wall. But anyway, leaving that aside, I mean, the disaffection from people at kind of the American Conservative, I think, comes to the extent that he has departed from being the person he said he would be during the campaign.
Yeah, did he really though?
So there is and so in other words, to that extent, what he's become already is on the New York Times op-ed page, right? Those parts of him are there. He got a tax cut. He right.
Right. Like,
so, well, what I would say is, it seems to me we can divide the ideological kind of milieu of Trump into 2 parts. It's the part he said he would be and isn't, and then there's the kind of conservative he is, but he didn't say he'd be, and the latter already is on the New York Times op-ed page. But my question is, as for the former, what's wrong with people from the American Conservative as being, expositors of that and proponents of that, right?
Okay, but I guess I would say that both those sides of Trumpism are, I think, look a little more clear in retrospect. I think maybe they've both been sort of exaggerated and clarified. I think that what Trump was in actuality was a sort of lurching, entirely impulsive person who had bits and scraps of various ideas he'd encountered in his life that would go into the stew and pop out randomly. And it was possible from that chaos to find different patterns if you're looking for them. So I don't think either of those were ever really there, in the sense that nothing is really there in Trump. Do you know what I mean? Like there's no real set of views or coherent perspective. So I would still say I would be fine, like as a matter of course, like an empirically informed, non-lying, decent behaving, semi-kind American conservative type would be perfectly fine. I'd be interested. I'd go further.
I think
hear that perspective articulated. But insofar as it comes off as a coherent program, I still think it will mislead insofar as it's understood as actually speaking for what's actually motivating people on the right. Like, I still don't think it would capture, because I don't think you can capture that in ideas. I think you have to capture that in basically, it's a set of impulses, right? And impulses are not op-eds.
And I do think, I mean, I will say, kind of in defense of your thesis, I think what distinguishes Trump from people who might expound the ideology he ran on, and even some politicians who might represent it, although there haven't been that many, is just his willingness to appeal overtly to the part of it that is racist, that is xenophobic, that is misogynistic. He wants to bring out the worst in human nature and harness it. And, you know, Pat Buchanan would occasionally say something that kind of, you know, but Trump is a whole new level, I think. And certainly there are other, I think that's the scary thing about Trump, is he one of many. But
look at it this way. Insofar as there is an authentic constituency for the sort of Pat Buchanan, ethno-nationalism, etc., I think you would have seen some organized or at least articulated pushback against Trump when he so spectacularly abandoned that that perspective over and over again. But there wasn't really. Like, everybody's followed Trump. He has now swerved enough that I think the question is settled whether he has a coherent ideology. No, he does not. Like, I think we can agree to that now. And insofar as the base has followed him like a school of fish from here to there, to there, to there, to there, I feel like we have to include that they don't either. Right?
Well, I'd say two things. I think he's made a point of continuing to make kind of overtures, to continuing to, like, for example, on trade. He finally did get around to trying to start a trade war. That's what he said he'd do, right? He did get around to economic nationalism, and now he's vacillating and thinking, "Oh, I actually want to join TPP." But he does keep sounding the signals, and the same on immigration. I mean, the ICE, the ICE or ICE, whatever, they're doing, at the regulatory level, they're cracking down in a lot of ways, including a number that I find abhorrent. And so he is. And on the environment, as you know, he's using the regulatory muscle he has to dismantle environmental regulation. So, not that was an obsession of the base we're thinking of as distinctively Trumpist, really, but so there's that. But I also think it gets back to this, which is, once people are viewing things in sufficiently tribal terms, and once they view the rest of us as the enemy, he can get away with a lot, as long as he keeps convincing them that he's being persecuted because we hate him and the media hates him because we have contempt for them. I mean, that's half of his fuel at this point.
Well, all their corruption, it's the nature of tribalism. that it has the tendency to justify corruption, right? Corruption on our behalf, corruption or bad behavior on our behalf. So people are always asking me, like, what could Trump do that was so bad that would turn his followers against him? As long as he's doing it on their behalf, right, as the head of their tribe, they don't care. There is no answer to that question. There is nothing sufficiently bad. So none of this is. The only thing that would change their mind is not the violation of some alleged principle that governs us all, because remember, tribalism, insofar as you're tribal, you ignore or just do not acknowledge the existence of those. It's only if they could be convinced that he was secretly not part of their tribe after all. That's the only thing that would break the spell, and it is really difficult for me to even imagine what that would be. It certainly wouldn't be corruption or like using his office to enrich his business.
Now, you'd almost have to get a recording. You'd almost have to get a recording of him saying, "Can you believe stupid Midwestern rubes they talk about?"
Right, I know. It's fucking Ohio diners. I'm so sick of the Ohio diners. I hate that food.
But well, we should probably wrap it up. I mean, if you have 3 minutes, let's do something we resisted at the beginning, which is you broke the news to me that Sean Hannity is in hot water. I didn't want to lead with that because this may not air for a while, but I just want to say that there are not many things in the world that bring me true bliss. This news, I mean, because he is, first of all, he is almost the lowest. Well, I shouldn't talk like this.
Never use those superlatives anymore, Robert.
So apparently he turns Michael Cohen. Well, give me the details just quickly. So there was a woman that had to be paid to shut up, who he had an affair with.
No, we don't know. All we know is that the lawyer Michael Cohen had a mysterious, unnamed third client that he had done business with over the last few years that he refused to disclose, and now somehow it came out that it was Sean Hannity, which has prompted a level of sort of glee on Twitter that I haven't seen in years now. I think it's quite cathartic for people, but it's I think there's a unique pleasure, and I think that maybe this is what you're getting at, a unique pleasure for me at least in seeing. Because one of the things I hate about Trumpism and Trump himself and the whole phenomenon is this conflation of strength with bluster and aggression and just being a blowhard asshole, right? Like that's somehow for a whole class of people, that's come to be conflated with what masculinity means, with what strength means, just being a big blustery a-hole. And all those people, what they have in common is that they're paper tigers, right? It's like Bill O'Reilly. Like the minute you poke their balloon, they deflate. They're all cowards on the inside. And seeing Hannity, who might be the sort of ultimate avatar of blustery, overconfident asshole, brought low would be, it would not compensate for the last few years, but I feel like it would at least it's like a little life preserver, one of those little rings tossed in the water that we can all cling to.
Almost makes the whole Trump thing worthwhile, doesn't it, David? Just one day.
Are you in the we're gonna come out of this better and it's gonna be a healing fire camp?
No, I'm not in that camp. I'm in the camp. I'm in the I'll be surprised if we come out of it all.
Yes, I'm there in that camp with you.
Quickly, I want to say Michael Dougherty, who is, although he writes for National Review, Michael Brendan Dougherty, is in the American conservative realm, kind of. I had a conversation with him recently.
Smart and interesting, and I would love to have for him to have a column. He would be an interesting addition to the Times op-ed page, and he would bring something that isn't quite there. Ross Douthat has, I mean, he's not evangelical, but first of all, he's got the abortion thing. And that motivates a certain number of these voters, I think, more than you might realize. And I know from personal experience. But I think Ross has a little bit of he has an understanding of these things more than maybe some other conservatives. So they got that. But Michael Brendan Dougherty would be a good addition. And anyway, what he said when we talked, one thing he and I shared was surprise
that people, American voters, just weren't more grossed out by the kind of person Trump is. I don't mean the sex. I mean just the fact that he's an asshole.
Totally.
I thought Americans did not like braggarts. I thought they, I was surprised. I don't get that.
Yeah, and it's again, it is a tendency that poked through on the edges of plenty of previous Republican figures that again has just been purified and foregrounded. And I too thought that would be sufficient to expose its sort of repulsiveness and retroactively discredit the previous ones, but it had the opposite effect of sort of sanctifying that attitude and that idea that like.
Well, again, I think it's a testament to how much people like you and me are loathed by some Trump voters. I mean, I think it's the more dangerous and obnoxious and hateful they find the other tribe, the more they will not only put up with some of this, but maybe think it's like, I don't know, necessary. This is purely speculative, but yeah. I can't overemphasize how much I think it comes down to the antagonism felt toward the other tribe. And the sense of threat from the other tribe, which drives the antagonism.
No, totally. And this is like, insofar as there's anything that unites them anymore, it's less an ideology than just an external enemy, right? Just the sense that we're out to destroy the country. And if that, like I think you've written this before, but insofar as you literally convince yourself of that liberals really want to destroy the country, hate America, and want to destroy it, anything, what's not, like insofar as you love America, what's not justified by that, right? Like what level of assholery or aggression or cheating or anything is not justified if you're literally trying to save your country.
Right. And I have a whole sermon about how the resistance's perception of the Trumpists as a peril leads to certain tribalistic things that are not, in their own psychology, that are not optimal, but we've run out of time, so I was putting that sermon. But thank you so much for taking the time. Anything else you want to talk about that you've written or are writing?
No, I'm just like you, and everyone else, I am at once dreading and on the other hand, intensely curious about, right? Because we've all been wondering, what's the limit of this stuff, right? What's the limit of tribalism now? It's clearly way farther down the path than any of us thought. And now when Trump fires Rosenstein or Mueller or one or the other or both, is that it, right? Or are we just going to once again be set back on our heels and shocked that tribalism and partisan and polarization is even more powerful than that, right? That's been the last 2 years. It's more powerful than that and that and that and that and that. And now
I think if the question is how much support. If the question is how much support would he get from within his base, I think he'd get a lot. Maybe not quite unanimous, but I think he'd get a lot, partly because the way has been paved by people like Sean Hannity. It's been pretty systematic.
Sure, less about his base than if there's any institutional life left, right? Like if there's any life left in the institutions, in Congress, in the courts, if there's any devotion to principles above tribe. Obviously, the base, I think, is going to go along with him, but we're going to see if there's any life in the institutions left or in the Republican establishment.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. And also, what can they do at that point? I mean, what if the Senate, if Congress is going to do something, it needs to do it preemptively by passing one of these anti-firing Mueller bills, but there doesn't seem to be sufficient momentum, as far as I can tell, for that.
Yeah, I just keep thinking there's going to be some kind of tipping point. I've been thinking that for 2 years now, and we're just in this weird equilibrium that seems stable through anything. So I don't know. That's all I'm saying is, it will be interesting to see whether it will also be stable through this most dramatic of chapters we have coming up.
I still perhaps naively hope it won't happen, but
well, good luck to us all.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again, Ben. People can find you at Twitter at what? Dr. Vox? DRVOX?
DRVOX, yes. And of course, Vox.com.
Box.com. Okay, really appreciate all the time.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, see you, David.